The village of Bethany nestled quietly on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, its dusty paths winding between modest homes of stone and clay. A place overlooked by the grandeur of Jerusalem. Just 2 miles away, it thrived in its simplicity. Olive trees swayed in the dry breeze, their gnarled branches casting fleeting shadows over a community bound by tradition and toil. Here lived Lazarus, a man neither rich nor poor, known to many yet unremarkable to most. His days unfolded much like the seasons, predictable, steady, marked by the rhythms of labor and the warmth of kin. Lazarus shared his home with his sisters, Martha and Mary, 2 women as different as the sun and moon. Martha, the elder, carried herself with a quiet strength, her hands always busy, kneading dough or mending cloth, her voice firm yet kind as she managed their household. Mary, younger, softer, often lingered and thought, her eyes tracing the horizon as if seeking something beyond the hills. Together, they formed a trio woven tight by love, their bond a refuge amid the harshness of life under Roman rule. Taxes pressed hard, soldiers patrolled with cold indifference, and whispers of rebellion stirred in distant corners. But in Bethany, Lazarus and his sisters carved out a space of their own. Then came the fever, a heat that clung to his bones, sapping the strength from his limbs. Martha brewed herbs, Mary prayed in hushed tones, but the illness deepened, relentless. Word spread through Bethany, like ripples on a still pond. Friends brought bread, murmured blessings, their faces tight with concern. Children, once eager to chase him for stories, now peered from doorways, sensing the change. The sisters' home grew heavy with the scent of sickness, olive oil, and worry. Lazarus lay on his mat, his breath shallow, his eyes dimming as the days blurred into nights. Martha hovered near, her hands trembling as she pressed cool cloths to his brow. Mary knelt beside him, her whispers rising like incense, though no one could say if he heard. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and ash, his chest stilled. A silence fell, thicker than any before, broken only by Martha's sharp gasp and Mary's soft sob. The man who had walked their paths, shared their meals, borne their burdens, was gone. Neighbors gathered, their voices low, offering what comfort they could. The women prepared his body, washing it with care, wrapping it in linen as custom demanded. They anointed him with myrrh, its bitter scent mingling with their grief. By morning, they carried him to a tomb carved into the hillside, a hollowed stone waiting to cradle one of their own. The men rolled a slab across the entrance, its scrape echoing in the quiet dawn. Martha stood tall, her jaw set, while Mary lingered, her fingers brushing the rock as if to hold him a moment longer. The village watched, heads bowed, then turned back to their lives, leaving the sisters alone with their loss. The tomb sealed shut, a mute sentinel against the questions that lingered in the air, unspoken, unanswered. What lay beyond that stone? For now, Bethany held its breath. The story of Lazarus paused in the stillness of death. The tomb stood silent, its stone face unyielding against the Bethany sun. Inside, Lazarus lay wrapped in linen, the air thick with the stillness of death. 4 days had passed since his breath ceased, each one stretching long and heavy for those he left behind. In the village, time moved on, goats bleated, and women drew water from the well. But for Martha and Mary, the world had stopped at the edge of that sealed cave. The sisters mourned in their home, a modest dwelling now cloaked in shadow, their grief a quiet storm that filled the empty spaces Lazarus once occupied. Jewish custom held firm in those days, a rhythm of loss understood by all. The spirit, they believed, lingered near the body for 3 days, a faint hope that life might flicker back. By the 4th day, that hope faded, decay set in, and death became certain. Martha moved through the house with purpose, her hands folding cloths, sweeping floors, as if order could mend the tear in their lives. Mary sat by the window, her gaze lost in the hills, her tears falling like soft rain. Neighbors came, their voices hushed, bringing food and words of comfort, yet the sister's sorrow hung like a veil none could lift. Beyond the village, questions whispered through the minds of those who knew Lazarus. What lay on the other side of that stone? The people of Bethany held to the teachings of their fathers, tales of Sheol, a shadowy realm where the dead rested in silence. Some spoke of a waiting place, others of nothingness, a void where the soul dissolved like smoke. Had Lazarus crossed into that unknown, his spirit adrift in darkness? Or had he glimpsed something more, a presence too vast for the living to comprehend? No one could say, for the dead kept their secrets, and the tomb offered no answers. In the streets, murmurs grew. Where was Jesus, the teacher from Nazareth, the one Lazarus called friend? Word had reached him days ago, carried by a breathless messenger sent by Martha's steady hand. Lord, the one you love is ill. John 11, verse 3. Yet he had not come. 2 days he lingered across the Jordan, his absence a puzzle to those who knew his power. Some recalled his healings, the blind made to see, the lame to walk, and wondered why he delayed. Others shrugged, resigned to the ways of a man who moved by his own counsel. In Bethany, the sisters felt the sting of that absence, their faith tested as the 4th day dawned. The air grew heavy with more than grief. A faint stench seeped from the tomb, a reminder of time's unrelenting march. Martha wrinkled her nose, her practicality warring with her pain, while Mary seemed not to notice, lost in her vigil. The crowd thinned, the mourners returning to their lives, leaving the sisters to face the silence alone. What did Lazarus know in those 4 days? Did he wander a boundless night, his voice stilled, his thoughts unraveling? Or did he stand before a light none could name, held in a mystery beyond the reach of the living? The village buzzed with quiet speculation, unaware that the answer drew near, carried on sandals dusty from a distant road. Jesus approached, his steps measured, his face set with purpose. Word of his coming rippled through Bethany, a spark in the gloom. 4 days had buried Lazarus in darkness, but the teacher's arrival stirred the air, a promise or a challenge yet unspoken. The tomb waited, its occupant locked in silence, while outside, the world shifted, poised on the edge of something no one could foresee. Dust swirled along the path into Bethany as Jesus approached, his robe stained from the journey, his eyes fixed on the village ahead. 4 days had passed since Lazarus was laid in the tomb, and the air carried the weight of that time, thick with grief and the faint rot of decay. A crowd trailed him, some curious, others drawn by tales of his wonders, their whispers buzzing like FLIs. In the sisters' home, word of his arrival struck like a stone through still water. Martha rose, her face a map of exhaustion and resolve, and hurried to meet him, her steps quick despite the ache in her chest. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, she said, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. John 11, verse 21. Jesus met her gaze, his silence a weight, then spoke of life beyond death, words that hung strange and heavy in the air. Martha nodded, clinging to a faith she could not fully grasp, and returned to fetch Mary. The younger sister emerged slower, her face streaked with tears, falling at his feet. Lord, if you had been here, she echoed, her voice breaking. John 11, verse 32. The crowd pressed closer, skepticism threading through their murmurs. 4 days, they thought. Too late. Jesus moved toward the tomb, his steps deliberate, the sisters at his side. The hillside loomed, the stone slab a mute guard over Lazarus' resting place. Faces peered from doorways, drawn by the growing throng, their breaths held as if sensing a storm. "Take away the stone," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. John 11, verse 39. Martha hesitated, her practicality surfacing. "Lord, by this time there is a stench. He has been dead for days." The words hung raw, a challenge to the impossible. Jesus turned to her, his eyes piercing. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" John 11, verse 40. Men stepped forward, hands rough from labor, and rolled the stone aside, its groan echoing across the slope. A gasp rippled through the onlookers as the dark mouth of the tomb gaped open, the air sour with death. Jesus lifted his face to the sky, his lips moving in thanks, then called out, loud and clear, "Lazarus, come forth." John 11, verse 43. The words struck like thunder, sharp, undeniable, piercing the silence of the grave. A pause followed, heavy, endless, the crowd frozen, Martha's hands clenched, Mary's breath caught in her throat. Then movement. A figure stirred in the shadows, unsteady, shrouded in linen strips, hands and feet bound, face wrapped in cloth. Lazarus emerged, blinking into the light, his form a ghost made flesh. A cry broke from Mary, soft and wild, as Martha stumbled forward, her hands trembling to steady him. The men who moved the stone recoiled, awe and fear tangling in their stares. Others wept, some whispered prayers. A few edged back, their minds grappling with what they saw. "Unbind him, let him go," Jesus said, John 11, verse 44. The sisters tore at the cloths, fingers fumbling, freeing his arms, his legs, his face. Lazarus stood pale, silent, his chest rising with shallow breaths, his eyes wide with a light none could name. The crowd surged, voices overlapping, a tide of wonder and dread. Martha clutched his hand. Mary sank to her knees, their tears now born of something beyond grief. The tomb gaped empty behind them, its darkness shattered, its prisoner returned. Whispers spread, swift as wind, carrying the weight of what had happened, a ripple that would reach far beyond Bethany's hills. The sun hung low over Bethany, casting long shadows across the village as Lazarus stepped from the tomb's embrace. The linen strips that bound him lay discarded, torn away by trembling hands, yet their imprint lingered on his skin, pale and cool to the touch. His chest rose and fell, breath shallow but steady, a rhythm that defied the 4 days he had spent in darkness. Martha hovered near, her eyes tracing his every move, while Mary lingered a step behind, her gaze soft with wonder. The crowd had dispersed, some fleeing in fear, others whispering tales already growing wild, leaving the sisters to guide their brother home. The house felt different now, its walls too small to contain the strangeness of his return. Lazarus sat on his mat, the same one where he had breathed his last, his hands resting limp in his lap. His frame, once sturdy from toil, seemed frail, as if the grave had carved away some vital piece. His eyes, dark and unblinking, stared at nothing, or perhaps at something no one else could see. Martha pressed a cup of water into his hands, her voice gentle but firm. "Drink, brother." He obeyed, slow, mechanical, the liquid spilling slightly as his lips met the edge. Mary knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his arm, searching for the warmth of the man she knew. Words failed him. Where once he had offered quiet jests or nodded in greeting, now silence reigned. Did he remember the tomb, the call that pulled him back? His sisters watched, waiting for a sign, but he gave none. The village buzzed beyond their door, footsteps pausing as neighbors peered through cracks, their curiosity warring with unease. "He's alive," they said, voices low, "but is he the same?" Some brought gifts, bread and oil, laid at the threshold like offerings to appease a spirit. Others kept their distance, their children tugged close, as if death might still cling to him like dust. Nights stretched long in that house. Lazarus slept little, his breaths uneven, his body twitching as if caught in a dream he could not escape. Martha rose often, lighting a lamp to check his face, finding it etched with lines that hadn't been there before. Mary whispered prayers, her voice a thread in the dark, hoping to reach wherever he had been. By day, he moved through routines like a shadow of himself, lifting a hoe only to let it fall, sitting by the well without drawing water. The sisters adapted, Martha cooking meals he barely touched, Mary weaving stories he did not hear, their love a bridge to a man who seemed half here, half elsewhere. Rumors took root, sprouting like weeds. A blessing, some declared, pointing to the miracle, their faith kindled by his return. A curse, others muttered, crossing themselves when he passed, fearing he carried the tomb's chill in his bones. An old woman swore his shadow stretched too long. Another claimed his eyes glowed in the dusk. Lazarus heard none of it, or if he did, he showed no sign. His presence unsettled the village rhythm, a living question mark in a world of certainties. Did he feel the weight of their stares, the burden of being reborn? Martha wondered if he ached, if the pull of death lingered in his marrow. Mary pondered if he had seen beyond, if that silence was awe or terror he could not share. They asked once softly, what was it like? His head turned slow, his gaze meeting theirs for the first time since the tomb. A flicker crossed his face, pain perhaps, or memory, but his lips stayed shut, sealing the mystery within. Life resumed around him. Goats grazed. The sun rose, yet Lazarus stood apart. A man who had slipped death's grasp, only to find it had not fully let him go. The air in Bethany carried a new edge, sharp with whispers that drifted beyond the village's stone walls. Lazarus' return had ignited a flame, one that burned brighter than the sisters' hearth, its light reaching the marble halls of Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin, the council of priests and elders, convened in shadowed chambers, their robes rustling as they leaned over scrolls and muttered in low tones. Word of the miracle had spread, carried by travelers and pilgrims, a tale too wild to ignore. A man 4 days dead, walking again, summoned by the voice of Jesus, the Nazarene. In the village, life teetered between awe and unease. Lazarus moved among the living, his steps slow, his presence a quiet thunder. Neighbors watched him draw water, their greetings clipped, their eyes darting to the hills as if expecting trouble. Martha sensed it first, a shift in the wind, the way men lingered too long near their door, their faces masked with purpose. Mary noticed the silence that followed, the absence of children's laughter, replaced by hushed voices that spoke of priests and soldiers. The sisters shielded him, keeping him close, yet the rumors grew claws, digging into the peace they fought to reclaim. In Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin's debate simmered, then boiled. Caiaphas, the high priest, stood at the center, his voice smooth but laced with steel. This man Lazarus, he is a sign, a banner for the Nazarene's followers, he said, his hands clasped tight. The council nodded, some stroking beards, others shifting uncomfortably. Jesus had long been a thorn, his teachings stirring the crowds, threatening the fragile truce with Rome. Now Lazarus stood as proof, a living testament to a power they could neither wield nor deny. If we let this grow, the people will rise, and the Romans will crush us all, Caiaphas pressed, his words a blade seeking a mark. Plans took shape in those dim halls. Some urged caution, suggesting spies to watch the village, to track the man who defied death. Others called for bolder strokes, their voices rising with talk of silencing him, erasing the evidence of the miracle. A dead man who walks is a danger, one elder hissed, a spark to set the nation ablaze. They knew of Lazarus from reports, how he sat in his home, how the curious came to gape, how some knelt and called him blessed. Each story tightened the noose, marking him not as a brother or friend, but as a threat to their order. Bethany felt the ripple. A stranger lingered near the well one dawn, his cloak too fine for a shepherd, his questions too pointed. Martha sent him off with a glare, but her hands shook as she told Mary. Another night, hoofbeats echoed on the road, then faded, leaving only dust and dread. Lazarus seemed unaware, his silence unbroken, his gaze fixed on some distant point. Yet the sisters saw the weight settle, a shadow cast not by the tomb, but by those who feared its emptiness. Did he sense the eyes upon him, the hands plotting in far-off rooms? His stillness offered no answer. The Sanhedrin's reach crept closer. A merchant passing through whispered of orders, of men dispatched to question, perhaps to seize. The sisters barred their door, their prayers sharp with urgency, though they knew stone walls could not hold back a council's will. Lazarus became a ghost in his own life, a figure hunted not for what he did, but for what he was, a crack in the world they ruled, a proof they could not bury. The village held its breath, caught between the miracle's glow and the gathering storm, as the shadow of Jerusalem stretched long and dark over their quiet hills. Bethany faded into the haze of years, its dusty paths and olive groves swallowed by the march of time. Lazarus, the man who walked out of death's shadow, slipped from the pages of the story that birthed him, his voice never captured in the texts that followed. What became of him after the tomb, after the Sanhedrin's whispers turned to shouts? The scriptures grew silent, leaving a void that invited tales, each thread spun from wonder, fear, and the human hunger to defy the grave. Some in the village swore he stayed, a quiet figure tending the land with Martha and Mary, his life stitched back into the fabric of Bethany. They pictured him older, his hair streaked gray, his hands steady on a plow, living out days marked by the miracle that both blessed and burdened him. Others disagreed, their voices hushed over cups of wine, claiming he fled, driven by the shadow of those who sought his end. Cyprus, they said, or Gaul, distant lands where a man could vanish, his story fading into the chatter of foreign tongues. A legend took root in time, tales of a wanderer who preached in shattered corners, his words carrying the weight of one who knew death's face. Apocryphal whispers painted broader strokes. Some early writings hinted at a mission, a life spent bearing witness to the power that called him forth, though no scroll bore his name in ink. Others spun darker threads, suggesting he withered under the strain, a man unmoored by what he glimpsed in those 4 days of darkness. Did he dream of the tomb, its silence a companion he could not shake? The church at Bethany, raised later in his honor, stood as a mute testament, its stones whispering of a figure lost to history's edges. Theories bloomed among the faithful and the curious. Scholars in later centuries pored over texts, piecing together a man who left no footprint of his own. A symbol, they called him, a mirror for humanity's longing to outrun mortality. Poets cast him as a wanderer, his eyes haunted, his lips sealed by a truth too vast to share. In quiet villages, mothers told children of Lazarus, a name to hush cries, a promise that death could bend. Yet none could say with certainty where his bones rested, if they rested at all, the mystery of his end as deep as the one of his return. His silence shaped his legacy most. Unlike the blind who sang of sight or the lame who danced, Lazarus offered no testimony, his story told through others' awe and dread. Did he choose that quiet, guarding a secret too heavy for words? Or had the grave stolen his voice, leaving him spectator to his own tale? The question lingered, threading through centuries, as his name echoed in prayers and debates, a spark that kindled both faith and doubt. Time turned, empires rose and fell, Yet Lazarus endured, not in flesh, but in the human soul's restless dance with the unknown. His unseen path, whether long or brief, near or far, wove a thread through history, tugging at hearts that yearned to know. What does it mean to cheat death? Bethany's hills grew still, the tomb a forgotten hollow, but the man who emerged from it lived on, a shadow cast across ages, lost to time yet never fully gone. The tale of Lazarus, the man who returned from the dead, stretches across the ages, a thread of mystery woven into the fabric of time. From the quiet streets of Bethany to the shadowed halls of power, his story unfolded, a ripple that touched the lives of his sisters, his village, and far beyond. He walked out of the tomb, a figure of flesh and silence, bearing a miracle that stirred out fear and questions no one could fully answer. What did he see in those 4 days of darkness? What price did he pay to step back into the light? The answers slipped away with him, lost to the winds that carried his name through centuries. His legacy endures not in stone or scroll, but in the human heart, a whisper of hope and dread entwined. Whether he lived long among his kin, fled to distant shores, or faded beneath the weight of his own tale, Lazarus remains a shadow on the edge of understanding, a man who defied death, yet left its riddle intact. His silence speaks louder than words, a testament to the unseen, a mirror for all who grapple with the boundary between life and what lies beyond. Bethany's hills have settled into memory, yet his story lingers, an echo that refuses to fade. For those who've journeyed with us through this untold tale, the narrator invites you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel to explore more stories that stir the soul. Like this video if it moved you. Leave a comment with your thoughts below, and share this video with those close to you so they too might ponder the mystery of Lazarus, the man who returned from the dead.